labor. All righty, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's forum on the state of labor across race and space. I'm your faculty moderator, Joy Tsuhako of the Sociology Department and proud member of Falcons Rising. This is the final event of the year hosted by Falcons Rising, which is a faculty-driven committee inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that Cerritos College is on the land of the Tongva Gabrielino indigenous people who have lived and continue to live here. We recognize the Tongva Gabrielino and their spiritual connection as the first stewards and the traditional caretakers of this land. We pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. Thank you. So this year, Falcons Rising supported a variety of events, including a panel on hip hop's influence on society, a talk by Dr. Jean Felser on her book, California, A Slave State, and a workshop by Indigenous Circle of Wellness on Indigenous approaches to mental wellness. You can find more information about our events at falconsrising.org. I'll drop that link in the chat for you all. We want to invite any campus community members, faculty, staff, students, et cetera, to join us in our efforts to forward the racial justice conversations and efforts at Cerritos College. As always, we want to thank Lydia Alvarez and the wonderful team at the Center for Teaching Excellence for offering this event on Cornerstone as a professional development opportunity for faculty to use towards flex hours. So today we turn our attention to the state of labor. We are joined by Dr. Alfredo Carlos, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at Cal State Dominguez Hills. We also have Audrena Redmond, Director of Anti-Racism and Social Justice with the California Faculty Association. And we have Sherri Bell, Labor Rights Professional and Advocate with the LA Black Workers Center. As always, we want to invite the audience to participate in the conversation by dropping your comments and questions in the chat, and we will get to those towards the end. And so to begin, if I could ask each of you to share a little bit about your background and experience in the labor movement. And we'll start with Dr. Carlos.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my how long? Like a minute, 2 minutes? I could give you the short version or the long version. I grew up
Couple
working,
minutes, yeah.
I grew up working poor. You know, which means that my parents were both working full time, but we still, you know, were kind of, you know, sort of, you know, like teetering poverty in the harbor area here locally in LA. And so I always grew up with sort of questions about, you know, political economy, you know, like why the American dream, you know, like if you work hard, you can make it. And my parents were the hardest working people I knew, but, you know, barely making it, even though my dad was a union member. And so when I went to college, I started learning about the intersections of race, class, you know, social justice, all of these things. And I got involved in my community. And then sort of like organizing around tenants' rights, sort of, but also labor solidarity, you know, working with workers on campus. Eventually I got an internship with SEIU, working for the Living Wage Coalition, worked with the United Farm Workers for a little while before I went back to graduate school to study, like, you know, not just how do we survive against these things that are oppressing us, but how do we start building out you know, an economy that works for people. And so that's what my research is on. But I've been involved in all the unions that I've ever like been in or close to. The UAW 265 as a grad student, now the California Faculty Association on my campus, co-president and a membership and organizing chair.
Excellent. Thank you. And next, Audrena, can you share a little bit about your background and experience with labor?
Sure. Well, as I was growing up, my father worked for the steel mill. And I remember how our lives were changed in the 80s when the steel industry was making huge shifts and people lost jobs, and we were purchasing more steel from China, for example. And he didn't think much of his union, right? So I didn't have a good impression of unions until I started working as a organizer for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. For about 3 years, I did different campaigns around the country. And that's when I had a real interaction with local labor leaders, and realized the importance of labor on politics, and the importance of labor and labor union members' relationship with politicians at all levels, right? I just had no idea the importance of that entity. And then, then I find myself looking for a way outside of politics to have more genuine and closer relationships with people. And that led me to work directly for labor, to understand from the people themselves what their issues are, rather than advocating from some meta level based on some numbers and a study or a survey that somebody did, as opposed to having real, genuine conversation and relationship with people, because I'm working with them, I'm organizing with them, I'm creating vision and moving transformative futures with them. So, long story short, my working as a political organizer led me to California, which, unbeknownst to me at the time, led me to CFA, which is the California Faculty Association. So here I am. I've been with CFA a long time, and I've done a lot of different roles, in part because I was taught something early on, which is this is make work, right? You make work, you create work, and that comes out of your visioning and your understanding of the industry and the people that you're working with. I think that's the fun of labor for me, is the visioning and the opportunities for constant growth, right? So yeah. And I need to do something. I need to back up and say a little bit, and that is that recognizing that we do not all see the world same. Some of us are visually impaired. Let me describe myself for those siblings. I identify myself as an African-American woman. I am the shade of coffee with some cream and a little bit of sugar, which I think describes my personality too. And I am wearing glasses so that I can see those who are on screen.
Love that. Thank you. All right, Sherri, can you share a little bit about your background?
So I was, just saying before we got started about how I really got my introduction to the labor movement after I'd already got out of college. I had an undergrad in communication studies, went to graduate school, got an MPA. And when I got out, I couldn't find a job. I graduated shortly around the economic crash in 2008. So I found myself at a work source center. And then from there, I began to advocate as an unemployed Black worker in the city of LA. I became a member of the LA Black Worker Center. And through that, I began to be trained in the field of organizing. So I was a community organizer there for about 4 years. I'm on the board now, and I still continue to work there. So basically, my experience with the labor movement is that you can turn a bad job into a good job if you make it a union job, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are challenges in the labor movement, right? I worked a lot with construction workers, and that's like one of the most racist industries ever, right? So we had to, there was a effort on my part to like how do we increase the leadership of people in the unions to be able to have a voice and champion things that they might get ignored, about, such as like being a Black worker or how to deal with discrimination, but also just like how do we expand good union jobs, right? We all know that that's a stronghold to the economy. So my experience is like dealing with labor is to get together, right, as multiple different occupations and just champion for change. Like, for instance, with the Raise the Wage campaign, it was the largest fight for a minimum wage increase in the country at its time in 2014. The ordinance got passed in 2015. It was sponsored and funded primarily by the LA County Federation of Labor, the LA Fed. So we wouldn't have a minimum wage increase without labor. Labor led the way and sponsored that campaign. It was community-based organizations like the LABWC. There were other unions. There were, just a whole bunch of different people. But it was the labor movement who sponsored that. And through that fight for $15 by 2020, which is now going to be $17 because it's tied to the consumer price index. So the minimum wage goes up each year. Is it's led to increases all across the country and within the state. So my experience in the labor movement has been organizing those workers who are in the union to exercise their leadership and champion better working conditions because you can't separate labor rights and racial equity. My experience in labor movement has been, outreach and education, and it's also been fighting for policies that increase the access and retention of good jobs. And making sure that when good jobs are created, that everybody have a chance to be included. Underrepresented workers, such as Black workers and women, have an opportunity to work in these good labor jobs. So my fight has been dual, right? Fighting for labor jobs to exist and expand, but also fighting for equity within the jobs for everybody to be able to work with dignity and respect.
Mhm.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all of your efforts that are so valued by so many people. So, Dr. Carlos, if you could give us kind of a picture of the landscape for folks who maybe are not as familiar with maybe the history of labor and also sort of the present kind of state of trends, I should say, trends both locally and nationally.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. The sort of history of labor in this country is really an interesting one because it's one that you don't learn about really in like K through 12 or even at the college level. But it's really the reason we have a lot of the things that we sort of take for granted. We were talking a little bit about, some of the things that we enjoy, like the 40-hour work week, the weekend, holidays, all these little things that exist in our normal reality. And I understand they don't exist for everybody, but those of us that do get to enjoy them because of labor struggles, not because anybody said here, like we're going to give you 3 days off or 2 days off or whatever that is. It's like hard fought. It took rioting. It was an extremely violent process. What I mean by that is that there was resistance, police, there was massacres. And so in terms of the history of where we're at actually a really interesting point because we're sort of back where we were kind of 100 years ago. If you think about the 1920s and 30s, everybody sort of, when you go through like, American government, you learn the history of the United States, you learn about the New Deal and how it was this great thing. That only happened because you had people in the streets, fighting. You had people all over the place, and this is one of the beautiful things about the labor movement is the labor movement has always, even though there is like racism within sort of trade unions and there was like that was rampant, there was also a lot of people who were working across racial boundaries, across gender boundaries, and so generally speaking the labor movement has a lot more solidarity in it than you sort of find other places. So 1920s 30s, there was all this activism like leftist, communist, openly communist. I have some Chicana feminists that I look up to who were openly communist, socialists. They had all kinds of people all over the spectrum fighting for stuff. And then you get the New Deal and you get a crackdown in the 1940s and 50s on, like especially after World War II, the Cold War crackdown on communists. And so like that's when the labor movement sort of shifted to being sort of a traditional like labor bureaucrats fighting for sort of collective bargaining agreements. And there was like a period of the post-war period where there was a boom where that was actually, unions provided excellent jobs. The vision that we have of the American dream is actually built in the 1950s. And so when people think about the white picket fence, the house, the nice job, the weekend, the vacation that you can afford to take a family on a vacation, all of that was built between the 50s and the 70s. In the 1970s, you have this period where to cut costs because union jobs cost employers more money, but not more money that they can't pay. They just, they want to profit more. So they're always looking for places to like extract the maximum amount of profit. They start outsourcing those jobs to other countries. And so since the 1970s and really ramping up in the 80s and 90s during the Reagan administration, you see sort of a period of union decline where like like former jobs, a lot of people think a lot of things that people attribute to like problematic racial discourses that we have in this country, like really originated the economy. You know, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, you had people all over the country losing, you know, really good paying, family sustaining jobs and having to go work in minimum wage jobs because those jobs got exported to other countries. And so since then, kind of, you know, workers have just been fighting inch by inch for like small protections. You know, the federal minimum wage is still 7.25. It's been 7.25 for the last 40 years practically. And so like labor unionism has been on a decline in terms of percentage of workers. And right now we're in this period where there's because of, you know, like labor saying, a lot of workers saying, you know, enough is enough. You know, we got to fight back. And they're starting to like at the same time, there's also a different generation. Generation Z is actually helping with this. Generation Z is finally we have a generation who says, you know what, like I don't just care about working. I don't just want to go to college just to be a worker and sell my labor for the rest of my life. Like, you know, what is life like? And so they're much more willing to leave jobs where, you know, they're not feeling valued. And because of those two things, you're creating a dynamic where employers now have to start paying people more. There's places that I remember that I seen the minimum wage jump up because Generation Z didn't want to work at McDonald's. And so McDonald's started having to pay even before policies were changed. And so we're at a period of a lot of labor activism that is happening for a lot of reasons, obviously like a lot of terrible reasons. Housing affordability, you know, the price of stuff is going up and people are just fed up with it. And so that plus Generation Z just saying, yeah, we're not going to work if it sucks, like, well, I might as well let it suck at home when my parents, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because, you know, like they're choosing to say, hey, we're not going to participate in this type of economy. We want an economy that works. We want to work at a place that we feel valued. And those things are the same that, you know, that people in unions and workers in general feel. So I'll end on this note. All the stuff that you see against, like, you know, I saw an article the other day that said that, you know, the Generation Z and millennials are, you know, are choosing not to invest in vacations or whatnot because they have to pay for essential groceries. Like, I mean, yeah, they're essentials. We need to eat. So that's the sort of the context in which we're in, and that's why we're seeing a lot of the labor activism and the resurgence of unions and all these industries that are just like part of it too is the degree of profits that people are making. Like, you know, Disney making $1 billion per movie, but like the animators don't get any of it. And you know, and just really quick, sorry, I know I said I was gonna end. Um, I have to do this because I don't think people understand what $1 billion is. And when we, you know, our human brain in terms of numbers at a certain point, they're just big numbers and they're just bigger and bigger numbers. And so when you say the difference between 1 million and 1 billion, you're just like, oh, 1 million's a lot, 1 billion's more of a lot. That's how your brain interprets it. The difference between 1 million and 1 billion is if you count it in seconds, 1 million seconds in time is 11 days. 1 billion seconds in time is 32 years.
Say that again. I like that.
1 million seconds in time, like if you just started counting 1, 2, 3, if you counted to 1 million, it would be 11 days. And 1 billion, it would take you 32 years to count to 1 billion.
Really helpful context that you're providing for us. And I think about what you said about Gen Z, you know, not, you know, sacrificing vacations for groceries. And if I recall, I think that article specifically framed it as like, oh, Gen Z is splurging, like that's what they're splurging on, groceries, which is such problematic framing, right? It's like people have to eat, right? That's not really what's going on here, is that they're being deprived of these other, you know, joys, right? That we should all be able to access.
Yeah, like somehow it's avocado toast the reason I can't buy a, you know, $800,000 house in LA.
Right. Right. So thank you for that context. So important. And, you know, as you led with, and as the conversation was, you know, before we got started here, such a disservice that this is not commonly addressed in standard curriculum, but perhaps also not a mistake, right? That folks are not, young people in particular, are not exposed to this history because it's so empowering, right? To understand the legacy of that struggle, the benefits of that struggle, and the importance of continuing to engage in that struggle. So now I'd like to hear each of you sort of, with your expertise with different labor populations. If we can hear from Sherri in terms of the state of labor issues presently that are particularly affecting Black workers.
Yeah. So, I think it's about isolation, sometimes in certain occupations that we're not really populated in, right? So in case folks didn't know, labor unions were formed to keep Black workers out of good jobs once they were freed from being slaves. So the labor movement started off being really racist and segregated. It was A. Philip Randolph who organized. It took about 10 years for him and many other people to desegregate the sleeping car porters, right? To desegregate that union and have it recognized by the AFL CIO. So now, thanks to that fight, the union is desegregated. However, we're still fighting up against a lot of those ideologies. So when you think about Black workers in the union, Black workers are the most densely populated workers within unions. Like Black workers know the value of unions. We're taught growing up, get yourself a good government union job, right? We know that is a way out of poverty. However, I think that we're up against capitalism, right? And I think that you hit the nail on the head when you're like about why aren't we taught these things? Because we live in a capitalist society. And when you think about labor movement, you're talking about taking some of that power away from capitalists and redistributing it to workers, right? And so we're fighting up against all the normal things, but then on top of that, it's the compounded issues with racism. So some of the things that we see, that I think that what will help, right, is the fact that a lot of unions are these business models, right? So they want contracts, they want work. Like hotels want, hotel jobs, construction workers want to build things, different unions want the work. And I think the problem is sometimes within the labor movement that they don't take a hard enough stand against the people who they have a contract with and who's the company, right, on their expectations and standards as it relates to all of their members being treated fairly, right? For them to know that they're going to be held accountable. I think that labor could do a better job at that. I think it's changing. I think that we're starting to see it more. But so Black workers have that fight, the internal fight. And then, you have the other issues, just around promotion and, not being trained properly to get the promotion. So although we believe a lot of Black workers understand the access to union jobs and want to see more of those jobs prolificated across many different sectors, I believe that it's going to take a lot of inner working internally, right, for the unions to set standards within their agreements about how they, are going to fight hard and take a stand against anything that goes against equity, and really drive home that they're going to hold these companies accountable for for discrimination, for isolation, for things that people face on a day-to-day. I think that I think that the Black workers are always going to be pro-union, always going to be out there on a picket line. But I think that what we've seen over the summertime, when we had the SAG-AFTRA and the Writers Guild, some of the more elite unions, right, fighting for equity. Many Black workers felt like, wait a second, we have some issues here that also need to be addressed, right? We need to have diversity in storytelling. We need to have diversity at the, in those big meetings, right? We need to be able to have, more broader issues addressed than just wages. And so, that's always going to be a fight. That's why I think that one of the things that could be the labor union can do is put a real infrastructure in for caucus building, right? So their unions have different caucuses, like they'll have a Latino caucus, they'll have a women's caucus, and they have Black caucuses too. And that way, different union members can be sure that they are building power around different issues that impact them. So yeah, so I guess that's what we see. You know, we always have a fight within a fight, and it'd be great to have that support to build power and have the infrastructure to maintain it within these different labor unions across different sectors.
Mhm. Thank you for that. I think when I hear you use terms like, you know, isolation and discrimination, I think about some of the research that I'm familiar with faculty of color experiences that, you know, speak to isolation, tokenization, discrimination, racial battle fatigue, cultural taxation, right? And so with that, I'd like to hear from Audrena. Can you tell us about some of the things that CSU, or excuse me, a CFA has been fighting for faculty, and in particular faculty of color?
Jeez, I was over here making a list as I was listening to Alfredo and to Sherri, and it keeps growing. And I say it keeps growing because I have the privilege of once upon a time being a member of, but more extensively being an employee of the California Faculty Association and being witness to and very much a part of the growth and transformation of this organization. And the biggest part of that, I think, is our view of ourselves and our doing the work, which is always mindfulness and learning work, right? Because there is no arrival with anti-racism and social justice work. It's a constant. I think for us, it's one of the biggest challenges. There are many, but I'm just going to say this and then I'm going to list some others, is reminding folks to always have the lens of an anti-racism social justice lens and building our union framework around that. So in other words, we center anti-racism and social justice. What does that look like? That looks like always asking ourselves, who's not in this conversation? How do we get those missing people in the conversation? And how do we make sure that those missing people, once they're present, feel empowered, listened to, heard, seen, all of that, right? That is an ongoing struggle. But I have witnessed and again been part of the transformation of this union. And once upon a time when I started working for CFA, I used to call myself the little dark cherry on top of the ice cream, the vanilla ice cream, right? I don't say that anymore. I am now in a bowl of delicious chocolate cherries with some yogurt pretzels and other things, because it is more diverse. It is way more diverse and richer for that, but that took some effort. So some practical issues that we're facing right now are parental leave. Unbelievably, for people who work in an institution of higher education, which are sending folks out into the world to make great changes and progress, we are fighting for parental leave still. We moved from 8 weeks of, was it, Alfredo, I'm going to look to you, correct me because I might get it wrong, 8 weeks of parental leave to 12, right? So that's not even a full semester. Semester is 16 weeks. These are unbelievable, but we've made progress and we will make more progress on getting folks a full semester off for parental leave. We've got Title IX issues, as many of you may have read about. There is, I don't know how many of you have watched the 80s movies of college and the relaxedness of relationship between faculty and students, right? Well, some people still think that's the world, and it is not, because we've talked a lot about Gen Y and Gen Z are just not accepting things in the same way. We're having a renaissance of student awareness and young folk awareness about a number of societal things, among them being sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior. So there are many opportunities, and CFA is very much involved in shape shifting what those changes look like for us in the academy. it will be big. And I'm looking forward to that. There are a couple of bills in the legislature right now working on that. I think another issue is one would also think that institutes of higher learning would understand the value of having employees with what's the word? With steady employment, but they don't. In the CSUs, more than half of the teaching faculty are part-time workers. They do not have permanent tenure track, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm looking for a word that's not coming to me. They do not have permanent secure employment, right? They are contingent workers. And how many of us know that, where we have ourselves or our relatives have work, but you're not working 40 hours a week because somebody's trying to deny you benefits, or someone's trying to not have to pay you but so much. And so people end up having to have 2 or 3 jobs. Like some of you students may know, have faculty at Cerritos who also teach at Compton Community College, or at Long Beach Community College, or at Pasadena Community College. And that's the contingent economy, right? Where people have to work extra hard trying to make a living. Well, that's a problem in the CSU. And that is a problem that reflects.
I know really quick, I know faculty who sometimes have to drive for Lyft or Uber because they didn't
That's
get
right.
class or that class. And
That's
so
right.
real contingent.
That's right. And,
Sorry,
and
Audrena, didn't mean to interrupt.
that's okay. I knew you would jump in on that. And but you threw me off, man. So that's not that, and that is a reflection of, I don't know how many of you may have heard the term penny wise but pound foolish. That is a reflection of short visioning by an administration. And why wouldn't it be short visioning when administrators are brought into those ranks and told that if you are in a position more than 3 to 5 years, then you're not promotable, right? So they don't come into positions thinking that they're going to be there to make significant change. Unlike many of our folk, our members in CFA who are committed to higher education, who are committed to education. So this is who they are and what they do. So we have people leading the academy in the ranks, in the terms of administrators, who are not there to really make significant change because they don't want to do anything that's going to be controversial and affect them from making their next step, right? And they're not visionaries. So those are just huge problems. And then I think the other stretch, there are many, but just is we are organizationally, we CFA we just finished a contract fight that was historical and monumental on a number of levels, not just because of what we won in that fight because previously for reopener bargainings, this was just huge. However, we missed something as an organization because we're in a growth moment we didn't quite recognize. And that is the level of activism of our members, and how in just like rapid fire that is transforming the organization. There have been many changes over the course of years, and I've got this whole workshop and history timeline and everything that sort of tracks and shows that. But we're in this I'm calling it a renaissance moment. We're in this renaissance moment that I don't know what's going to be on the other end, but what I do think will happen is that there will be more members engaged, and that is every union's lust. Let me just say that it is a lust of every union, every organization, is that you have more people engaged, right? So I could go on because there's a whole lot. We are always, what did I call it? Short breathing, because there's so much to do. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think of, as you speak to how many faculty are contingent, experiencing that precarity, and how much that overlaps then with how difficult it may be for them then to raise issues of racial discrimination, sexual discrimination, et cetera, because they're so concerned about getting their next assignment. And being able to, pay their bills, as so many people are concerned. I do want to read some of the comments that are coming in the chat, just for those who are going to watch this recording and won't see the comments. Sherri, you highlighting that you can't separate the fight for labor rights and civil rights and racial rights, right? They are one and the same. Delvin, highlighting that organizing on class lines is difficult because this factor of racism has not been resolved. You cannot simply force solidarity that does not exist. And I think, that goes back to this idea of also our lack of understanding of the history of racialization in this country and how it really originates with wanting to divide laborers, right, in this country, along racial lines in order to compromise the power and ability of labor to push up against the capitalist class. Dante highlighting the importance of the part-time faculty fight for healthcare, and that as a student government member, he stands in solidarity with those efforts. And Sherri giving a bit of a background on the LA Black Worker Center and how it's specifically, a multiracial coalition. And so I definitely encourage folks to check out the LA Black Worker Center. All right, so coming back to
Wait, may I just, I don't mean to throw, but may I say something? And that is why I want folks to always think about, we have to center anti-racism and social justice. Otherwise, it becomes a conversation simply about class or simply about whatever an issue is, but it doesn't have that lens. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying anti-racist, okay? Anti-racist is individual, because a racist is an individual. But if what we want to do is to make systemic change, systemic meaning, think about the structure of the thing and who is ultimately in charge, right? What is ultimately the structure that's the problem? Then we have to be thinking about this as anti-racism, because anti-racism with an SM at the end is about the system. It's about the structure that creates what we are. It's the structure that supports that. And races support the system. So if we really want to make big change, focusing on the individual is one thing, but we need to focus on the system. And I think that's what Sherri's work does for sure, is focus on the system.
Yeah, jump in, Sherri.
Yeah, I just want to say, looking through policy creation and implementation through a racial equity lens, that's how you really get to the heart of the disparities, right? That's why the LA Black Worker Center is a part of the LA Worker Center network, because there's other workers who are being exploited. There's Latino workers who are being exploited in the car wash industry and in the underground economy. And we all work together around policy that's gonna look at things through and looking that, is who's getting affected and in what way. That's how you're going to really get to the change. Who's being affected in what industry? How badly are they being affected? That's how you go after certain policy points to address those disparities around salary, about and how to increase people's access to good paying work, and how to hold employers accountable in certain industries, because the link between exploitation and exclusion, right? Like when I was talking earlier about how slaves were, they were like the new free cheap labor that people were scared of, right? Oh, we got to keep them out. And now you flash forward, now you look at migrants coming across the border, like, oh, they're going to take the job. Like all that is connected to capitalism. And we can't ignore that these types of tactics have been used to pit people, to take our mind away who's really making the big decisions, right? And oftentimes they don't look like Black and brown workers on the ground, fighting over jobs. A lot of the folks who are making the decisions, that's what we got to keep our eye on, and to create the real change. So I just wanted to just point that out as well.
Great. Yeah. So I'd like to, insert a question here about AI, we've seen so many, labor struggles as of late, specifically, looking at the role of AI and how it's impacting workers and pushing more folks towards that precarity that we mentioned. So would anyone is anyone able to speak on this, the advancement of AI and how that's challenging workers?
Yeah, let me sort of jump in. Before I get to that question, I want to sort of echo something that Sherri and Audrena were talking about in terms of the Renaissance in faculty, like the activism. I think is rooted in a history of sort of racial and labor struggles. So like if you look at the fact that the professoriate professors are becoming and teachers, there's I guess still a question about teachers that somebody sort of wrote about, that as we've made gains in educational systems that were historically made not for us, for people of color. Like people have gone on and sort of, gone into higher education, but also to be professors in higher education. Well, one of the reports the CFA put out, I want to say maybe 10, 15 years ago, was as the CSU got browner in terms of our students, the funding for the education sort of dropped. I think you can say the same thing was happening to the teaching profession and the faculty profession. And because of that, you're also getting an influx of people who are used to the struggle. So like we're getting a lot of younger, newer professors at the CSU level who were engaged in union activism as a teaching assistant at the UCs and other universities. You're also seeing a shift in sort of how professors see themselves as the salaries have gone down in relation to inflation. Like, before, professors didn't see themselves as part of the working class. They saw themselves part of, like, the intelligentsia, like sort of a petty bourgeois, like, I'm not a worker anymore. But as our salaries, like I'm a second year tenure track faculty member. I was a lecturer, adjunct before. I can't afford to buy a house in LA. I grew up here. And so as that has happened, people are like, of course we're working class. Like we can't afford to live in the communities that we're teaching in. And so you see sort of a shift in the thinking about even just how the profession is work. Like, and so that's one of the mission that we have at CFA is that, our faculty teaching conditions, our working conditions, our student learning conditions. And so we're seeing a shift in all of this. It's influenced by struggle. And so to get into sort of like I'm gonna say something a little bit about Latino workers, that it's related, it's
I meant
connected.
to ask you, sorry.
Yeah, I know. I was waiting because I know I had talked first. So like really quick, that the racial struggle and class struggle are connected. Like to me, they're inseparable in the context of that the discourses of dehumanization, the discourses of like making people feel devalued and oppressed, those are on purpose. Like the discourse of racial hatred towards African Americans historically was to justify why they sort of deserve to be enslaved because they're not really human, and that continued and ramped up even more after Reconstruction, like during that after the Civil War, because now you had to justify why like even though they're free they still don't deserve these things, and that got extended. I mean it started with native people to take their land, and it was eventually extended to brown folks, and now it's immigrants and it's refugees, that you dehumanize people to justify the exploitation that they deserve. I did an interview the other day with talking about garment workers. The majority of garment workers in the LA area are undocumented sort of immigrants, and the reason there isn't policy change is, and the reason the discourse is, you see the former president talk about how, all the immigrants are, dangerous. There's purposeful launching of these discourses that are racialized. And obviously not everybody experiences it the same. And we can talk about different magnitudes of like, how people experience racism, but that it exists purposely to like justify why they deserve to be living in ghettos or barrios, or like in the conditions why a faculty are browner now, they don't deserve living wages. And it goes all up and down all these levels. So in terms of Latino workers, like the majority of Latino workers in the United States are in the service industry, industries where they are basically sort of the backbone of like restaurants, hotels, And it looks differently in different parts of the country. Like we're in the Southwest, which, you know, like historically used to be Mexico. So it's largely Mexican American or Mexican related. And you get different kinds of Mexicans. You get like generationally, like you get Northern Mexicans and Central Mexicans. And now it's a lot more like, you know, Southern Mexicans that are learning Spanish here in the United States because they have to. They're coming from with their indigenous languages. But that's also starting to shift. You're starting to see a lot of Haitians and Dominicans who are also migrating to do these jobs that even sometimes when we racialize jobs, it bothers me because they're like, you know, oh, you know, only Mexicans do farm labor. Well, historically, that's not true. It used to be, obviously, we know it was African Americans. We know it was we know it was poor white folks did that work. And now it's a lot of Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and like people that do that work do it because they're desperate and they have no other options. And so that's how these sort of racial and class dynamics are interconnected. And to sort of transition to the AI question is, you know, like I talked about, you know, how historically in the 1970s, they outsourced jobs to other countries in order to save money. And so they're looking to AI to cut costs. And it's one of those things where there's room for resistance. So I saw an article the other day that, you know, all these self-checkout lanes that Walmart or whoever was putting it out, they're actually rethinking the policy because they're actually losing a lot of money, and they're also losing a lot of clientele because people don't want to interact with machines. Um, but it is sort of a serious threat to like traditional sort of like trade jobs. You know, I know people at the port are really like they have been anxious. We've automated a lot of the port jobs, and so a lot of the unions are like, you know, like how do you know, like how is this going to affect us? Historically, they've tried to automate even farm work, which has been really slow and really expensive to do that. They can't work as fast as like the people out there. Have you seen any of those TikTok videos? So we're at this weird moment in terms of even that academy, like, you know, like faculty are like, how do we, you know, some people are on the like, no AI, we can't use Chat GPT, like, you know, versus people who recognize, well, this is becoming part of the normal. How do we make sure that we integrate it in ways that it's a tool that's helpful, that helps people grow, but that is also not affecting sort of job creation? Or how do we create jobs with the AI so that there's a transition from, you know, old technology to like newer technology? And I think that's what the labor organizations are kind of like, we're all like kind of wait and see, like, hey, what do we do with this thing? Especially in the context, a lot of people don't know how it works.
Well, yeah, it's Joy, if I may.
Sure. Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, artificial intelligence in the academy is a frightening thing, right? Especially anywhere that folks do research and that your words are held with the level of esteem, right? Because who's vetting that? It's sort of the same issue that folks had a long time ago with Wikipedia, right? Like, who's vetting this? How do we know that this is even valid? Or Google, like I do it. I'm so guilty of it. I Google everything, and that I have to remind myself to double check the source, right? Like, is this really valid? Is this really real? So artificial intelligence it's in some ways it's a storm we are flat-footed on, again, because the lack of administrative vision. There's no vision coming from these folks and no preparedness about how we deal with this thing and what it means. In fact, what it is sort of a rampant excitement about it because of different influencers, moneyed influencers, capitalist influencers on how much can be farmed from the university. In other words, our intellectual capital, right? Because the part of being a faculty is your intelligence, it's your thoughts, it's your writing, it's your speeches, it's what you're saying. And who's regulating artificial intelligence? It just is all out there in the ether and can be compiled into various things uh, that we don't know. You don't even know if you, at some point, if you're teaching an online class, I mean, are you really teaching a real person or are you teaching a bot? I mean, who knows, right? Um, it's troublesome, the lack of um, understanding and regulation of it. And it's troubling the support for it on one end and the lack of support for faculty and what they can do, and students even, because I think it's important that students learn the importance of, what do we call it, of fact checking, and of, quite frankly, doing the hard work of doing the research yourself. there is the learning in that. Look, I'm from the era where I would go to the library and every research project took me forever because I got lost in the world of microfiche. Oh, am I telling on myself? Yes, I am. Anybody, long time ago at the library.
I I just want to add too. I think like the season that we're in is like the rise against corporate greed, right? Like when you think about hot labor summer, people are tired of the income inequality. When you think about the corporate structure now is how it's profit over people. The top priority of many corporations is maximizing the profits of shareholders, right? That's why you see massive profits more than ever before. Production is at an all-time high. Profits is all at an all-time high, yet wages are stagnant. And that's because corporate models now is to please the folks that are on the stock market. And also they have these buybacks that they do to inflate the value of their company. So it appears that there needs to be corporate reform because all of this is connected, right? AI, we can't stop technology from evolving. It's going to do that. It doesn't always mean that it's going to eliminate jobs, right? We have that fear, right? But all labor can do is ask for transparency, try to look for jobs that can be converted into union jobs that will use AI, meaning having humans and AI work together and create good quality work. There's things you have to roll with the times. Unions have to be proactive. I think what unions are trying to do is to have more proactivity and more transparency. But I think that like what we're really fighting to get and what has to change, and I think that what we're rising up against and what the world is seeing now is that the way that corporate models have evolved over the years has created these huge wealth gaps and maximized massive profit for corporations and schools are no exception, right? Colleges and universities are always raising fees, yet the people, the teachers and the professors who are doing the work, wages don't reflect the growth and the wealth amassed by the universities. And who's winning, right? The people at the top. And I think that what we're fighting against is to shake a little resources from those trees. I think that there definitely needs to be severe government intervention and oversight and some type of major reform on how corporations, CEOs can have a company of workers and have a person at the top and have these investors, and the CEO gets to buy back stocks on the stock market and all this corruption, right? And I think that we won't stop trying to fight against it as the labor movement. We're going to continue to fight, but we have to be very open and transparent and educate. Labor has to do a better job and continue, or I don't want to say a better job, but like has to continuously educate their members about what's going on here. Because this is getting out of hand. And I think that AI is just a reflection of a way to take jobs away from humans in order to not pay people, and then you get more profit, right? Capitalists probably wouldn't even hire people if they couldn't. They will have machines doing it all.
But then that causes a crisis, because one of the problems is that, and this is what happened in the 2008 sort of financial crisis, is that like when you put people out of work, what people no longer have in their pocket is disposable income. And when people don't have disposable income, they're not buying stuff. And so if they're not buying stuff, you don't need people to make stuff. And so it causes a sort of trickle thing. One last thing I want to say about AI is that, to me, the only problem of AI in any technology really in our current system is who gets to own it, who gets to control it, and who gets to benefit from it. And so like people, workers are rightfully in this context, like, scared of AI, like, oh, that means you're going to take my job. Or, like cashiers everywhere have lost their jobs. I used to be a cashier at Home Depot, and I feel like I still am a cashier at Home Depot because now I got to check myself out.
Exactly. And you're not getting
Now I'm
paid.
not getting paid for it. But the only problem, that's only a problem in the current configuration of our economy, right? So if we think about like who gets to own it, who gets to control it, and who gets to benefit from it, like what if we implemented technology and AI to lighten people's load and continue to pay them the same amount? Because we know these corporations are making more than enough money. They could internalize the cost of like, Like, okay, maybe this year we don't make $29 billion, selling coffee. Maybe we make 27, and those 2 billion can go to actually like make sure that people have like a decent standard of living. My work is really around worker ownership, and like, what does it look like to have, instead of having these private companies, like even on a state level, like utilities, for instance, Southern California Edison, or PG&E in Northern California, which we've known, and we know the reason that forest fires continue to happen in Northern California is because they refuse to reinvest in their infrastructure, because they're trying to feed all the stockholders, right? They want to make sure that all stockholders get their dividends. But what if the workers, or what if the state of California was a stockholder? Then the money would go into investing in the infrastructure to make it usable for everyone. This is what as a faculty member, I argue with, our overpaid administrators all the time. I had a conversation the other day with the president on our campus, and he was giving me the CEO spiel, like that as a CEO he makes less, and I told him, you're a public servant. You're not a CEO. You're the president of the state of a university at the state of California. And so I disagree with you about how much money you should be making in the context of we're public servants. And so part of this is having a larger discursive conversation about who gets to benefit. Like, in our current economy, yes, we should be against AI, because the benefit is largely going to be to cut costs for corporations so they can make more money. But what if the AI or tech in general became part of the commons and went to benefit people, so people had more leisure time, people had more days off of work, work for, like people are trying to move the conversation on a 4-day work week, so that people can actually enjoy the life that, they're struggling for. And so, how do we bring back that idea of the commons, and that things should belong, city resources should belong to the city, and like those kinds of things.
Right. As we talk about the wealth gap, and Sherri, you bring up these buybacks, and the need for government intervention, and the fact that we're seeing, part of the consequence of that is that, as you said, fires across California, which of course there are multiple, things that contribute to that, but definitely deregulation. We have Boeing planes falling out of the sky, or if not falling apart, falling out of the sky. And so, in the last several decades, as we've seen this wealth gap grow in this period of neoliberalism, I want to shift the conversation now to national politics. So we know that, the growth in buybacks really was a result of Clinton policy, right? Democratic policy, and thinking about the history of political alignment, how often Democrats were considered to be a party for workers, right? Defending workers and supporting unions. And now we have President Biden, who claims in his own words to be the most pro-union president in history. And we saw him in these last few years. He walked the picket line for auto workers when they were on strike. But then on the other hand, he also sided against railway workers when they were fighting for I believe it was like 1 day off, something like that, right? And so the question is, what are your thoughts on Biden's claims to being labor friendly? And then also looking forward, what can you tell us about your thoughts on the 2024 election and the candidates, the offerings that we have to choose from?
Where do we start?
Yeah, I know. That's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Well,
I can talk. I don't want to
okay.
dominate the conversation. So
I mean, I could just say real quick that like that railroad strike happened the attempted strike back in 2022. Railroad workers were fighting for paid sick leave, as they should so graciously be provided as human beings, right? But see, the thing is, what people were looking at was like in the immediate, what was in front of their eyeballs is like, oh my God, if this strike happens, we're going to lose $2 billion a day, and 30% of U.S. cargo is not going to get shipped, and it's going to cause a massive like catastrophe, right? Yeah, but how do we get there, right? That is like the last case worst scenario that we saw before us. This particular situation, that when Biden blocked these railroad workers' ability to strike, was averting that kind of catastrophe. However, what is this? It's a larger symptom of a problem of corporate greed, right? These railroad companies, they want to make they make all the list profit, but they're not being held accountable in how they operate. And I think that what Biden is going to have to eventually do is going to have to take a closer look and in how business is being done in this country. Because basically what's going to happen is the corporate model in which these railroad companies currently operate under is profit over people. Right. And so, of course, if it's going to come down to the world shutting down and losing $10 billion a day over providing sick leave, not only like the general public is going to probably empathize with averting a strike, if that's what it's going to take. But this could happen again, and I think that what Biden did, he waited till the situation got so bad and not intervening early and not doing enough to facilitate a better compromise amongst the workers in these corporations. He essentially just allowed the corporations to flex their muscles and not allow the worker power to manifest and do its thing, right? He basically like silenced worker power by forcing them not to strike. And I think that is what I do not agree with. I do think generally Biden and his administration does believe in infrastructure, creating good union jobs, and all of that stuff. But the jobs are only going to be as good as the companies are going to be held accountable for. Yeah, I would just say that it was very sad that the workers' power were silenced and they couldn't successfully negotiate in a reasonable way. And because we wouldn't have got none of the gains we got with the teachers, right? UTLA, they went on strike. Was it this year? Last year, SAG-AFTRA, and all of those gains were done through a work stoppage, a strike. That's how they got the wins that they got. And for Biden to take that away from folks, which is the only industry I believe that this kind of thing could be done in, you can see what happened. They didn't get any sick leave. They got 1 day. They wanted 15 and they got 1. So I don't know. I'll just leave it there.
I think we're one, I talked about the New Deal when I started, right? Like it wasn't FDR who was like, hey, I want to do this. This is gonna be my running positions. He got forced into doing a lot of that stuff. Politicians always have to. And so in terms of where we're at, somebody alluded to Genocide Joe, like that's a real thing that the Democrats need to take seriously. They need to take seriously that there's a whole swath of people who just can't square a circle of I don't care how pro-labor you are, I don't care how like you're better than that guy over there. Like that's, for a lot of people, that's an issue. And in terms of like I don't think in my lifetime I've ever really seen a pro-labor like Democrat in a real way be elected. I think that a lot of times, because part of it too is because labor unions are workers organizations, we have financial resources, but we don't have like the financial resources that corporations have. And so because of our financing system for elections, and especially after Citizens United, like they have to cater to, so even if you want to be pro-labor, like how pro-labor can you be if your opponents are like the Koch brothers funded, and they're funding like upwards of $1 billion per election. And then on the other side, like we're seeing kind of the convergence of all of these different issues, right? So like there's this labor stuff, but then there's also like the sort of racial aspect of the sort of growing white nationalist movement in the United States as a response to this like austerity. All these austerity measures are connected, like and so some people are racializing them. Oh, it's because they see African Americans or people of color like like moving up in economic ranks, and they latch on to this sort of racial discourse that Trump sort of launched because it got him elected. I don't think Trump actually believes anything. I think he says whatever he says to just, to be in the spotlight. I think he's a narcissist.
Mhm.
But like to cling on to some semblance of power, Republicans have, like, said, all right, we're gonna side with this dude. And so, like, I think at the end of the day, I think people in general, we're gonna see, and it's unfortunate, a lot of people don't recognize that Hillary didn't lose necessarily because of, like, like, a lot of people stayed home with Hillary that went to vote for Obama. So a lot of people, so it was like the people that stayed home, actually, that was the margin of victory for Trump, when she lost. And it was because I think, as a political scientist, I think a lot of people stayed home because they didn't see a vision with her. And so it goes back to what Audrena was saying, is that you have a lot of people with no vision. They have piecemeal reforms. You have piecemeal, like, oh, we can improve the minimum wage, rather than really thinking, like, yeah, but it's not just the salary, because, like, this is the problem with you increase the minimum wage. Like, okay, I got more money in this pocket, but then all the landlords know that I got more money in this pocket. So what are they going to do tomorrow? They're going to raise my rent. And so this is why we need systemic change, and we need to also start thinking about restructuring our society in ways where people benefit more. So, like, this is why, in LA, there's a lot of people who are growing out the community land trust sort of movement, like, where they're buying out land and running it collectively as community. And so there's I think 5 or 6 different community land trusts in LA that are newer in the last 5 to 10 years. It got built. How do we keep more money in the hands of the people that create wealth, which is workers? How do we make sure that it's done equitably? How do we make sure that, we have, an anti-racism, social justice lens built into sort of, like, yes, fighting for, collective bargaining agreements, being in the streets. I mean, we've seen how that's starting to work in terms of, the Israel-Palestine situation. Like, Democrats are finally being forced to, like, contend with that. But that's because of the sustained sort of efforts, and I think we're going to have to keep doing that. So we have to keep having hot labor winter, hot labor summer 2.0. We have to keep the pressure on and actually expect better from our politicians, even on a local level. I think we need to start vetting people a lot earlier, because sometimes people fail upwards. They just, they get elected just because they've been around long enough. And I think we need to start demanding better politics from people.
Mhm.
Sorry, I'm a political scientist. I can go on. I'm a nerd.
I'd like to add, and I know our time is running, I'd like to add that I agree that Biden might be the closest thing we've gotten to a president who's labor friendly in a very long time, right? However, there's still the ongoing struggle with student loans, which I think is worker friendly, right? To eliminate those loans, which are unreasonable, for folks to get started to build the economy. Because, I mean, the facts show during the pandemic, when people's loans were forgiven, what did they do? They poured that back into the economy. They strengthened themselves and their families in other practical ways that were needed. And I know that they've just come out with a new forgiveness, which seems like it's going to work better for people, and for more people, but we need it to be real law, not executive law, not, any of those sorts of things, executive policy, because it's not law then. Um, yeah, yeah, I'll leave that at that. And I'm going to drop a link to a talk that Astra Taylor did at our CFA Equity Conference in 2002, on this very thing, student fee, student loan debt, and how it's a problem. And she called it from here to there. Well, your debt is someone else's asset, which is all of the conversation we've been having.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of that particular issue, like, obviously we know why it doesn't pass, because the banking institutions don't want it to, right? And the opposite also happens is, all those PPP loans that for businesses, that the majority that got taken by big businesses, like, those get over, like, overnight, and the Supreme Court never has anything to say about that. And so part of that is this is long-term project of us like really changing the discourse around, what's acceptable and what isn't. And we should be taking care of people, not corporations.
Right.
They get bailouts every single time. The banks are about to fail, they get the bailout. Nobody ever bats an eye. Nobody says, oh, that's bad, oh, they're the job created. And that's not true. The job creators are the people that spend money. When you go to a movie theater, you're creating a job because you're creating demand. People that
That's
spend
right.
money. And it's like Audrena said, if people ain't got no money because I'm paying back a student loan, I'm not spending any disposable income. That leads to an economic slowdown. And yeah, and so we need to figure out all these different ways are really about putting more money in the hands of people, not just because money's a good thing. Money allows you to have a life of dignity, a life filled with leisure that you deserve, because people deserve to enjoy their life, not just at the end of it when you can't do anything. um you know they're trying to extend the retirement age to like 70. Like, like if I'm like, when I turn 70, I don't want to go anywhere. Like I'm like my bones already hurt. I'm barely 43. Like I'm already tired. Like I can't imagine like what retirement really I can't enjoy like life until I'm 70. That's ridiculous.
I know that in this time that we have, we're able to scratch the surface of this topic, and want to thank you for your time. We're a couple minutes over, but if there's anyone that has a pressing question that you'd like to have the panel address, I think we have time for maybe one question. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like. Really, really great conversation. Such, insightful, perspectives that you all offered. Everyone just expressing gratitude. So I think this is a good time to end this conversation.
Last thing,
Yeah,
last final thought. I keep seeing people saying that it is infuriating, but you got to keep at it, right?
That's
Like,
right.
not to appropriate, but the arc of the moral universe is the justice is long. So like you understand that if you're about this work, that you got to just kind of keep at it. You got to like get other people involved. You got to keep angry. I know that not everybody's a sort of Bernie supporter, but like Bernie changed the DNC in a lot of ways. It forced them to look in the mirror, and they've been looking in the mirror and they resisting it. When you tell people their truth, sometimes it doesn't land right away. When you're honest with your sisters, sometimes they get mad at you, but then eventually, they're like, hey, yeah, my bad, I hurt your feelings, I'm sorry. And so it's the same way, like, we just got to keep at it. We got to keep getting more people involved, engaging more people, because, like if we all push together, like we can change this place. Like this place has been different, when people say, I hate it here. Yeah, I hate it here. But I can say, I'll invoke another one, James Baldwin, because I love it here. I will, I always forget the quotes verbatim, but like, because I love it here, because I love America, I insist on the right to like critique it incessantly. And we're
Mhm.
going to keep critiquing it because we think it can be better. We don't come from a place of like, we hate this place, like F this place. We come from a place of, we think we can do better. And we just gotta keep doing that, pulling together.
absolutely. I think you sum up sort of the purpose of Falcons Rising, but want to invite everyone to support all of our participants today. Join the classes. If you students, if you guys want to see more labor studies offerings and things like this, make noise. The squeaky wheel is the one that gets attention, and we'll do our best. Call to action for faculty, like how are you talking about labor issues, incorporating it into the conversation in your classrooms, knowing that it's not really happening in other spaces, and students don't come to us with this knowledge. So in closing, right, just want to thank everyone for their time and everyone who's participated in Falcons Rising events this year. Looking forward to putting some great ones together next year, and please join us in these efforts. Thank you, Alfredo, Audrena, and Sherri, for your time.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you. It was my
Everybody.
pleasure, an honor.
Love being in conversation with y'all, and yeah, I'm sure
Yeah,
I'll see y'all around.
We could go on. I know. I'm
I
all
know.
primed now and ready to keep going, but